In 1942, the world was caught up in the chaos of the Second World War. For the United States, this marked a time when factories turned into the arsenal of democracy, producing weapons and supplies for allies globally, while American troops fought hard in Europe and the Pacific. However, as America battled fascism overseas, it wrestled with deep contradictions at home. Racial segregation, the internment of Japanese Americans, and the ongoing denial of civil rights to millions of black citizens. This video explores how America's role in the war was shaped not just by its military might, but also by the racial dynamics that influenced its actions on both fronts. From the racially charged conflicts in the Pacific to the Double V campaign advocating for victory over fascism and racism, we'll look into how the U.S. war effort reflected the nation's conflicting ideals of freedom and discrimination. But this story isn't only about America. In Germany, we'll examine the internal resistance against Hitler, spanning from military conspiracies to the brave, though often unsuccessful, efforts of working-class and communist activists. As the war drew to a close, grassroots movements like the Antifa committees emerged, eager to rebuild Germany from the ruins of Nazism. Sadly, these efforts were largely suppressed or overlooked by the victorious Allied powers, who were more concerned with their post-war plans than the freedom of the German populace. By the end of this video, you'll have a clearer picture of how the war shaped both America's rise as a global power and Germany's descent into devastation, and how on both sides, the conflict between imperial aspirations and the struggles of the people left a profound legacy that continued to influence the world long after 1945. The United States was key in shaping the outcome of the Second World War. 405,000 Americans lost their lives, and an astonishing $330 billion was spent. While these casualty figures pale in comparison to those of the Soviet Union, America's role as an arms supplier was significant. Through the Lend-Lease program, it provided vast amounts of military resources. The Soviet Union received about 1/10 of its weaponry from the U.S., while Britain received double that. In many respects, the U.S. position appeared to differ from its allies, as it had fewer colonies and more readily accepted the idea of a people's war. In 1940, President Roosevelt gave a significant speech declaring the U.S. as the great arsenal of democracy. He criticized the Nazis for their claims of racial superiority and the subjugation of others. Just a week later, he insisted that the national policy was without regard to partisanship and focused on preserving civil liberties for all. Yet we shouldn't overstate the distinctions between the U.S. and its allies. America's involvement in the Second World War marked what Ambrose termed its rise to globalism. In 1939, the United States maintained an army of only 185,000, backed by an annual budget of less than $500 million. At that time, there were no military alliances, and no American troops were deployed overseas. Fast forward to 30 years later, and the defense budget ballooned to over $100 billion. The U.S. had formed military alliances with 48 nations and stationed 1.5 million military personnel across 119 countries. Before the Second World War, while America's route may have differed from that of European nations, it had been involved in internal colonization through westward expansion and the devastation of Native American communities, alongside the exploitation of enslaved Africans. Thus, when considering whether the U.S. war effort reflected an imperialist or a people's character, race, often labeled the American obsession, became a central issue. This was particularly evident in the treatment of Japanese Americans following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which was orchestrated in Tokyo. Federal authorities swiftly turned against Japanese Americans, leading to Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 in March 1942, which mandated the internment of all persons of Japanese ancestry in the Western Defense Command area, affecting 120,000 individuals, including 70,000 American citizens. Since the mid-19th century, Asians on America's West Coast had faced exploitation, with racism deliberately stoked to lower their wages and create divisions among workers, both white and non-white. The Japanese faced consistent discrimination. During his presidential campaign in 1912, Woodrow Wilson noted that the Japanese could not integrate with the Caucasian race. A few years later, the governor of California emphasized the idea of preserving racial identity. In a well-known court case, one person was refused citizenship solely because he did not fit the Caucasian category. By 1924, this perspective had solidified into national law, which stipulated that only those identified as free white persons could obtain citizenship. The architect behind Order 9066, the Western Defense Commander DeWitt, candidly explained his reasoning was based on racial theory. He branded the Japanese as enemies, claiming that while many second and third generation Japanese Americans had assimilated, their genetic heritage remained intact. He contended it was unrealistic to expect children of Caucasian parents born in Japan to sever their ancestral ties and pledge loyalty to Japan. Although those who enforced Order 9066 viewed their actions as an overreaction, they held the belief that the recognizable Caucasian features of certain individuals made them identifiable to most Americans, while distinguishing one Japanese person from another proved difficult for the average observer. This ambiguity regarding the identification of individual Japanese residents raised concerns about the capacity to surveil those suspected of disloyalty effectively. The stated justification for Order 9066 was rooted in military necessity. DeWitt wrongly claimed that Japanese Americans were leaking sensitive U.S. intelligence, a notion that even the cautious FBI director, Hoover, deemed unfounded. To navigate the lack of evidence, a curious argument emerged. The absence of sabotage to date is actually a worrisome indication that such acts may be on the horizon. Despite officials asserting that internment had the public's backing, secret polls in the impacted areas showed that merely 14% supported the initiative. Citizens recognized the fear tactics employed by politicians and the media. The execution of Order 9066 mirrored the Nazi approach of Aryanization. Japanese people were herded into old horse stables, barns, and pigpens before being sent to long-term relocation camps, such as the bleak one in Minidoka, Idaho. The term concentration camp was carefully avoided. They brought only what they could carry and lost homes and property worth $400 million. In one camp, a riot was quelled by soldiers, leading to 2 deaths and many injuries. When a doctor revealed that protesters were shot in the back, he was removed from his role. The internment policies drew criticism from surprising quarters. The head of the War Relocation Authority voiced his discontent with a policy he had to enforce, feeling it played into the enemy's narrative of a racial war and highlighted the contradiction of a nation that champions democracy while practicing racial discrimination. Those impacted by Order 9066 expressed their anger, questioning how they could communicate to fellow service members that they fought for democracy while their families were imprisoned without cause. The disparity in how the United States waged war in Europe compared to Asia showed the influence of race. One veteran remembered a drill instructor stating, "You're not going to Europe, you're heading to the Pacific. Don't hesitate to fight the Japs dirty." A war correspondent described horrendous acts by American troops, stating, "We shot prisoners in cold blood, wiped out hospitals, strafed lifeboats, and finished off the enemy wounded." Sometimes, the goal was simply to seize their gold teeth. When the same veteran asked about a shooting he heard, he was told, "It was just an old gook woman. She wanted to be put out of her misery and join her ancestors, I guess. So I obliged her." When Britain's Bomber Command invited the 8th United States Air Force to participate in Operation Thunderclap, which aimed to kill about 275,000 Berliners, General Cabell of the United States objected, claiming such baby-killing schemes would harm the legacy of the Air Forces in America. Still, the United States engaged in the bombing of Dresden for strategic purposes. Senior United States commanders, similar to their British counterparts, understood that their air forces were crucial assets for post-war negotiations and that demonstrating strength to the Russians was vital. In the conflict with Japan, the racial elements were stark, with strategies targeting civilians becoming standard practice for the United States in the Asian theater. Those who criticized such measures as un-American were met with backlash, as the weekly intelligence review echoed sentiments akin to Stanley Baldwin's. We are determined to hunt down and eliminate the enemy wherever they may be, in the largest numbers and the shortest time possible. For us, there are no civilians in Japan. The raid on Tokyo on March 10, 1945, illustrates the grim reality of the war, claiming the lives of 100,000 individuals. Air Chief Curtis LeMay referred to it as the greatest single disaster incurred by any enemy in military history, emphasizing that the casualties exceeded any prior military incident. David Lilienthal, chair of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, captured the essence of the conflict with Japan by stating, "We burned Tokyo, and not just military sites. We aimed to obliterate the entire city, disregarding civilian lives." The atomic bomb epitomizes a total neglect of the ethics of warfare. The methods of destruction haven't just grown more violent. Rather, the lines between combatants have disappeared. We, who consider ourselves civilized, have pushed the absence of rules to an extreme. This perspective extends to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even while knowing Japan was looking for peace, Secretary of State Stimson pushed for the atomic bomb, aiming at areas filled with workers and their families. One historian highlights that, stripped of euphemisms, this meant inflicting immense civilian casualties. Harry Truman, Roosevelt's successor, acknowledged that the atomic bomb was far worse than gas or biological warfare, as it devastates the civilian population on a massive scale. Nuclear bombs killed approximately 200,000 people right away and critically weakened medical resources that could have supported civilian care. In Hiroshima, 65 out of 150 doctors were dead, and most of the remaining ones were injured. Of the 1,780 nurses, 1,654 were either deceased or unable to work. At the main Red Cross hospital, only 6 out of 30 doctors were able to operate, and just 10 of over 200 nurses could contribute. The aftermath of the bombing was indescribable. People had burned and swollen faces and hands, with skin peeling away like rags, leaving them unrecognizable. Their eyes, noses, and mouths were scorched off, as if their ears had melted away. The conclusion of the Holocaust might stand as one of the strongest arguments for viewing the Second World War as a good war. What was the Allied perspective on the suffering of the Jews? When Hitler annexed Austria in 1938, London imposed visa restrictions that made it increasingly difficult for Jews to escape. By the time the war began, only 70,000 out of 600,000 Jews looking for refuge had been permitted entry. After 1939, the doors were firmly shut, labeling anyone from Axis territories as an enemy alien. Britain's Foreign Secretary blocked the rescue of 70,000 Romanian Jews, fully backed by the American Jewish community, worried that it would set a precedent for similar requests from those in Poland and Germany. An American official expressed disbelief at this stance, noting that the United States had taken a more effective approach. By January 1944, the War Refugee Board was established, saving around 250,000 Jewish lives. Yet, it's important to recognize that only 9% of the funding came from the government. The rest was raised privately. Moreover, as Wyman points out in his remarkable book, the creation of the board was delayed, and the journey was fraught with challenges. By 1941, U.S. officials were aware of the extermination occurring in Europe. In July 1942, a protest of 20,000 took place in New York against the Holocaust, receiving support from both Roosevelt and Churchill. However, Roosevelt appointed Breckinridge Long, whom Eleanor Roosevelt called a fascist, to oversee immigration policies. His strategy involved repeatedly delaying visa approvals, effectively freezing immigration indefinitely. To make matters worse, the U.S. visa application was extremely complicated, 4 feet long, requiring completion on both sides by a sponsor or refugee aid agency, sworn under penalty of perjury, and submitted in 6 copies. It asked for detailed information not just about the refugee, but also about the 2 American sponsors who needed to guarantee that the refugee was not a threat. Each sponsor was required to share their living and work history from the last 2 years, along with character references from 2 reliable Americans whose backgrounds were easily verifiable. Then came a harsh dilemma. In Axis-controlled Europe, There were no consulates available to issue visas, and those who managed to escape to places like Spain and Portugal were deemed to be in not acute danger, which led to the rejection of their visa applications. This situation drove a prominent Jewish socialist in the Polish National Council to take his own life. He expressed that while the direct blame for the murder of Poland's entire Jewish population belonged to the perpetrators, the passive observation of these atrocities, of innocent children, women, and the elderly, by the Allied nations made them complicit in this crime. He thought that since he could do nothing meaningful while alive, perhaps his death might break through that indifference. The formation of the War Refugee Board toward the end of the war is overshadowed by the United States' failure to stop the operations at Auschwitz. Vital information about this death camp came from two escapees, Verba and Wetzler, in early 1944. Research suggests that up to 437,000 lives might have been saved if bombing missions had targeted Auschwitz's railway lines and crematoria, but the War Department called it impracticable. Between July and October 1944, 2,700 bombers flew routes covering rail lines on their way to targets in the Blechhammer Auschwitz area, and on several occasions, nearby attacks actually shook the camp. This evaluation has led to intense discussions. The claim that the Western Allies were solely focused on defeating Germany weakens when compared to their significant efforts in evacuating Spanish children during the Civil War and supporting the Warsaw Rising. Acts of humanitarianism seem to have occurred only when they were politically convenient. One ardent supporter of Roosevelt argues that the president truly believed it essential to commit all of America's resources and influence to winning the war. The key question remains, which war was he really fighting? The People's War aimed not at political advantages, but at preserving basic decency and protecting human life. Claims that nothing could be done to save the Jews, or that such efforts would distract from other priorities, are effectively countered by Denmark's example. Even under German occupation, only 474 of the 7,000 Jews in the area were taken by the Nazis, thanks to many locals who hid them during the roundups. The resistance organized a fleet of small boats to smuggle these individuals across the Øresund to neutral Sweden. In Bulgaria, a large swath of society united with a strong determination to protect Bulgarian Jews from the pro-Hitler fascists in parliament. As a result, the cattle cars remained empty, and Bulgarian Jews fought side by side with their non-Jewish compatriots in a significant partisan movement. This effort to rescue Jews was far from futile. One participant emphasizes that many historians err when they attempt to separate the rescue of Jews from the larger resistance efforts. They were all interconnected. Many of those who escaped later returned to the fight. About 1.5 million Jewish men and women actively participated in combat against the Axis powers, with the United States and Russian armed forces each contributing around 500,000. In Eastern Europe, Jewish underground movements operated in 7 major ghettos and 45 smaller ones. Uprisings occurred in 5 concentration camps and 18 forced labor camps. Defying incredible odds, there were armed rebellions in the death camps at Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. Jewish resistance had a dual nature. Often, established Jewish organizations sought to counter the spread of Nazism through collaboration. Tsur notes that the Jewish population, like others, was divided. Resistance could only emerge from a proactive ideology that opposed the prevailing situation and envisioned change in the cultural and political landscape. As a result, those who resisted often had prior ties to anti-establishment groups. A contrasting example comes from the Vilna Ghetto, infamous for one of the darkest chapters of the Holocaust, where the head of the Jewish organization betrayed the leader of the ghetto's armed resistance to the Gestapo, shortly after 33,500 of its 57,000 residents had been buried in nearby pits. When Roosevelt declared that the United States of America, while advocating for freedom and democracy, African Americans, who made up 1/8 of the population, faced the grim reality that in 12 southern states, only 2% of eligible black voters could cast their ballots. Additionally, the average income for black individuals was only 40% of that of whites. They likely remembered the president's response to the many lynchings that occurred in 1933. When the NAACP leader urged him to support an anti-lynching bill, he said he couldn't take that risk, citing the influence of racist white Southern Democrats in critical Senate and House positions. Truman, his successor, made it clear in 1940 that he wasn't promoting social equality for African Americans, stating, "The Negro himself knows better than that." As the U.S. military expanded from a few 100,000 to over 14 million, the government had to address the needs of the nation's 9 million black citizens. In 1940, the Selective Service and Training Act required that the military accept anyone, regardless of race or color, promising that there would be no discrimination. However, the armed forces remained entirely segregated. Roosevelt asserted that the War Department's policy was to keep colored and white enlisted personnel separate within the same regimental organization. It appeared that no discrimination only applied to the separate groups, not between them. The Secretary for War suggested that blacks were primarily agriculturalists, implying that black units had not been able to master modern weaponry. In the Navy, black individuals were limited to roles as messmen and cooks, since the Secretary of the Navy remarked that it would be pointless to train those who, because of their race, could not effectively assume higher positions. Admiral Nimitz claimed that desegregation was the Soviet way, not the American way. In the Army, 95% of black soldiers were restricted to support roles, as General Marshall argued that integration would complicate the significant responsibilities of the War Department, jeopardizing discipline and morale. With racist morale prioritized, whites could lead blacks, but blacks were never given the opportunity to lead whites. By 1940, there were only 2 black Army officers, and segregation even reached as far as blood donations. Protesters criticized this as being against the very values for which the war was fought, comparing it to a policy reminiscent of Hitler. Beyond this, many other injustices persisted. One black soldier recalled seeing German prisoners moving freely around the camp, while black soldiers faced various restrictions. The Germans could walk anywhere, just like white Americans. Though we wore the same uniform, we were treated as outsiders. In towns, German POWs were permitted to sit at the front of buses, while black passengers were relegated to the back. He concluded that the USA was essentially fielding 2 armies, one black, one white. When the idea of segregated bomb shelters was brought up in Washington, D.C., one newspaper humorously remarked that it would be just like Hitler to compel American whites to face a fate worse than death by having to rush into a black bomb shelter. Some radical black voices responded by rejecting participation in the war entirely, questioning why they should fight and risk their lives for Roosevelt's America, for the Jim Crow South, for low-paying labor, and for a life filled with discrimination, police violence, and persistent poverty, even in the supposedly more progressive North. In response to discussions about saving democracy, one black newspaper asserted, "We cannot save what does not exist." For a significant number, the Second World War was seen as a white man's war. A striking 38% of black individuals felt it was more important to make democracy work at home than to defeat the Germans and Japanese. An often cited phrase expressed this frustration. Here lies a black man killed fighting a yellow man for the protection of a white man. However, for the majority, the Second World War represented 2 separate battles. This sentiment was echoed by the Pittsburgh Courier, the largest black circulation weekly, through its well-known Double V campaign. The Double V stands for victory against enemies abroad and victory against those at home who would deny the Negro full and free participation in every aspect of national life. Thus, the Negro is fighting on 2 fronts. Though the campaign aimed for unity, it contained contradictions and variations. An article from the Courier declared that Double Vi is a victory slogan embraced by Negro America as a reflection of its long-standing patriotism to the ideals conveyed by President Roosevelt. Yet, other accounts revealed that during his presidency, lynchings, Jim Crow laws, workplace discrimination, and voting restrictions continued to thrive. With a military steeped in bias, the country remained vulnerable to Axis propaganda and their cunning strategies. If we can't uphold democracy at home, How can we genuinely pass the torch to those who need our support and must also stand by us? A black soldier put it plainly: it was a matter of lynching versus morale. The clash between these two issues became evident throughout society. Corporate America was flourishing like never before, with defense industry profits surging by 250% and prices rising by 45% compared to pre-war levels. But wages, sadly, only crept to 15% above the 1941 benchmark. The discrimination against African Americans in defense jobs was shocking. Even with labor shortages, over half of new defense roles were officially closed to black workers in 1941, and 90% of those who did land jobs found themselves stuck in low-paying service or unskilled positions, compared to just 5% for whites. In January of that year, A. Philip Randolph, the socialist leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, announced that black workers would demand their rights in both defense jobs and the military. His March on Washington movement is regarded as African America's first major demonstration aimed at federal officials, seen as one of the most significant black movements in American history, and the first large black organization led by trade unionists. Randolph argued that the national defense system was filled with racial prejudice and discrimination. Promises had been made, but real change was absent, signaling that blacks needed to act rather than just plead. Real power lies not with the elite, but with the masses. Onward to Washington. Let them come from every corner, using cars, buses, trains, trucks, and even on foot, no matter the elements. Soon, the original estimate of 10,000 marchers grew to 100,000. In reply, Roosevelt accused the organizers of siding with the Axis. He pointed out that today's threat to our national security is more than just military might. The strategy is clear. It begins with creating division. A small group, whether defined by region, race, or political stance, often pushes its agenda using misleading phrases and emotional arguments. Such tactics can dangerously stall armament efforts and disrupt national unity. However, Roosevelt chose a different path. He created the Fair Employment Practice Committee to look into discrimination complaints and resolve grievances, which led to the cancellation of the planned march. The Fair Employment Practice Committee was seen as a vital step toward eradicating job discrimination, but troubling signs emerged. Mark Etheridge, the committee's chair, pointed out that nothing, even the combined forces of the Allies and Axis, could persuade Southern whites to abandon social segregation. Randolph became disenchanted, understanding that the Fair Employment Practices Committee faced challenges similar to those of Hitler's Nazism, Mussolini's fascism, and Hirohito's militarism. Once the march seemed less imminent, Roosevelt weakened the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which prompted Etheridge to resign in frustration. The conflict between the People's War and imperialist war in the United States was also marked by violence. Non-white employment rose significantly, driven more by necessity than the efforts of the Fair Employment Practices Committee. For instance, in 1941, there were nearly no Mexican Americans in the Los Angeles shipyards, but 3 years later, their numbers had exploded to 17,000. During the same time, 1 million people moved across the country. In San Francisco, the black population grew at 20 times the rate of whites. This rapid growth strained housing resources and resulted in 242 racial conflicts across 47 cities in just 1943. The most notable incident occurred in Detroit, where by mid-war, blacks and Southern whites were arriving at a rate of 1,400 each week. When a black housing project named after Sojourner Truth opened, riots broke out among whites. The local police stayed passive, as their chief commented that his officers were naturally sympathetic to the white mob. As a result, 33 of the 38 people hospitalized were black, and out of 104 arrests, 101 were black individuals. This marked the beginning of a larger confrontation in 1943. Efforts to bridge the divides included 10,000 black and white workers marching together in April to protest discrimination. Unfortunately, racism proved to be deeply entrenched. Just 2 months later, conflicts between black and white youths intensified, impacting 3/4 of the city. Once again, the state was far from a passive bystander in this ethnic turmoil. 34 lives were lost, with 25 being black individuals. Astonishingly, 85% of the 1,500 arrests were of black people, and 17 were killed by police. Can we suggest that these events arose more from societal divisions than from a divide between an imperialist government and its people? Racism had undeniably permeated the white working class, evidenced by numerous strikes aimed at keeping black labor out. Yet, these strikes also exposed social fractures. There was a stark difference between the American Federation of Labor, which represented a more privileged group of workers, and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, known for its inclusivity. While many AFL unions officially excluded black members, the CIO welcomed them and set up over 85 anti-discrimination committees to address racism directly. At a CIO convention in Michigan in 1943, one delegate pinpointed the core issue. Divide the common people and rule has been the foundation for those in control of America's economic fate. The challenges originated from those in power. The beliefs of politicians, business figures, and military leaders trickled down into society. Take housing, for example. The National Association of Real Estate Boards equated black people with criminals and advised its agents to reject sales to African Americans, no matter their intentions, if it could lead to a drop in property values. Randolph powerfully summarized how the government heightened ethnic tensions. Federal Jim Crow policies affecting black individuals in the military, government, and defense sectors greatly fueled the race riots sweeping across the country. At times, the government would suppress the riots for the sake of wartime production, but this did nothing to eliminate the policies that set the stage for these conflicts. The scale and intensity of the clashes in Detroit, coupled with subsequent events in Harlem, underscored the ongoing racism from the state and the resolve of black individuals to stand against it. While these incidents unfolded in the North, similar struggles were taking place in the South. As lynchings increased, black soldiers started to push back. Many of these troops had come from northern cities, where they had little tolerance for the Jim Crow laws. In total, there were over 200 confrontations between black soldiers and both military and civilian authorities, with most occurring in the South. This was a pivotal time when black community groups like the NAACP were gaining influence. Though the NAACP later seemed more moderate compared to the Black Power movement, they often led the charge for justice during World War II. There was also a surge of self-organization among the soldiers. At Fort Bragg, the largest Army base, a black soldiers' council was established following a violent episode that resulted in the deaths of a black soldier and a white military policeman. A close look at an uprising by black GIs at Camp Stewart in Georgia shows a growing sense of militancy. Living conditions at Camp Stewart were grim, as one letter to the NAACP's leader passionately stated, "Please, for God's sake, help us. These old Southern officers treat us like slaves. They genuinely despise colored people. Please communicate with the War Department about our treatment immediately. We are not slaves." Many letters from this camp detailed horrendous isolation, terrible sanitary conditions, white officers abusing black soldiers, and insufficient medical care. It was reported that at least 3 men died each month due to race riots, with 2 more succumbing to overexertion. In response to an assault on a black woman by white soldiers, around 100 black soldiers assembled in military formation, armed with rifles, bayonets, and clubs, rallying others to join their ranks. The military police reacted by opening fire, throwing the camp into turmoil. After about 6,000 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition were fired, 1 military policeman lost his life. The confrontation at Camp Stewart was just one of many instances of racial conflicts occurring both domestically and abroad. The outcome of World War II was complicated for the U.S., as the country emerged as a superpower. While there may not have been a definitive victory for the people at home, there was undeniable progress in the struggle for justice and democracy. Beginning in 1943, white and black military service members were allowed to use the same recreational facilities, though at different times. By 1944, some black units were starting to blend in with white companies, and by 1948, the military had officially ended segregation. Despite facing many obstacles, the People's War had created an unstoppable surge. With leaders like Martin Luther King at the forefront, the movement for black equality was being rekindled, soon joined by new forces like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers to advance the cause. In the Axis nations, the People's War was unfolding amidst the horrors of torture. Anti-fascist movements not only had to endure the brutality of their own governments, but also faced the tough challenge of opposing their country's war efforts, all while dealing with the Allies' indifference. During Hitler's regime, 3 million Germans found themselves imprisoned for their beliefs, and tens of thousands lost their lives. One writer points out that these numbers underscore the resilience for resistance within German society and the severe repercussions it faced. Some established figures, aligning with the interests of the Allied governments, chose to resist. Yet, the challenges they faced became clear during the Czechoslovak crisis of 1938. Fearing that the Führer might ignite an unwinnable global conflict, influential conservatives, including the army's commander-in-chief, schemed to arrest him. They believed there would be no possibility of a hitch in their plan as long as Britain and France were ready to confront Hitler. Both nations were informed of the conspiracy, but neither was eager to see the German chancellor ousted. Sir Neville Henderson, Britain's ambassador in Berlin, noted that Hitler had made considerable strides in militarizing and industrializing Germany, viewing Czech objections to his aggression as resting on uncertain moral ground, while claiming that the Nazis were finally realizing the unity of Greater Germany. Henderson primarily wanted a strong Germany to stand against communism, believing that Moscow aimed to draw both Germany and the Western powers into a devastating conflict, ultimately benefiting as a third party. Thus, the plotters' pleas were ignored, leading to the sacrifice of Czechoslovakia. When the war began, the Allies shifted their stance entirely, unconditional surrender. This choice proved equally disastrous for the conservative resistance. Any initiatives aimed at promoting Germany's peace proposals would be met with utter silence, as Churchill noted. This stance left the conservative opposition immobilized, as they worried that trying to remove Hitler without prior agreement from the West could lead to a Soviet takeover, something they despised even more than Nazism. The Allies' strategies also diminished the ability of ordinary Germans to resist. Instead of rallying with the German populace in a common battle against Nazism, Britain and the United States bombed their homes, dropping leaflets that spread despair. "Our bombs fall on your homes and on you. You can't stop us, and you know it. You have no hope." The Red Army reinforced this grim message, as Russian soldiers fighting in the Great Patriotic War were urged to nurture deep animosity towards enemy civilians. Reports reached Stalin indicating that all German women left behind in East Prussia were violated by Red Army soldiers. This dire choice faced by German women was captured in a saying, "Better a Ruski on the belly than a Yank on the head." Ultimately, the Allies' tactics resulted in reluctant collaboration with Hitler's regime, allowing him to escape the uprising that had toppled the Kaiser in 1918. Yet resistance to Nazism still existed, showing itself in both imperialist and people's war forms. Most narratives spotlight the conservatives. Goerdeler, the mayor of Leipzig and Reich Price Commissioner, spearheaded an elite group that aspired to replace Hitler with himself as chancellor. Goerdeler's followers had the prime opportunity to assassinate the Führer, mingling closely with top Nazis. Stauffenberg's bomb on July 20th, 1944, nearly succeeded. Regrettably, Hitler survived, Operation Valkyrie failed, and the conspirators paid a heavy price with their lives. Their opposition to Nazism wasn't based on a rejection of German imperialism, but rather a debate on how to maintain it. Like Ambassador Henderson, Hassel, Goerdeler's shadow foreign minister, contended that a robust Germany was essential in confronting Bolshevist Russia. Goerdeler himself aimed to keep Austria and portions of Czechoslovakia within German control after the war. Although the Allied surrender at Munich may have derailed their plans in 1938, the conservatives gained fresh momentum after the Hitler-Stalin pact, fearing it granted Moscow excessive strength. The outbreak of the Second World War once again postponed their actions, as the German military seemed to be thriving. It wasn't until the summer of 1944 that they decided to act, driven by the impending threat of Bolshevism, as noted by Mommsen. Within Germany, the conservative resistance preferred authoritarian rule or monarchy rather than democracy. They thought it practical to maintain key elements of National Socialism for a renewed state. Mommsen contended that many top generals opposing the regime were complicit in the Third Reich's war crimes. Gordeler rejected the notion of unrestricted parliamentary democracy, suggesting that an elected body should hold only advisory roles without real legislative power. A small faction known as the Kreisau Circle, comprising aristocrats, trade union leaders, and socialists, moved beyond this conservative outlook, but they remained just a discussion group. When they found themselves caught in the fallout from the July 1944 assassination attempt, von Moltke expressed his sorrow, saying, "We only thought, we are outside of any practical action. We face punishment simply for thinking together." While the conservative resistance was driven by fear of failure and the desire to rescue German imperialism from the disaster Hitler was leading it toward, the workers' opposition arose from a profound rejection of the Nazi regime, war, and racism. The communist youth warned that young workers were being prepared for battle, stating that fascism must be eradicated to prevent war. The party called for unity with their Jewish comrades, while socialists sought to overthrow all advocates of oppression and violent groups that challenged freedom. Unlike many conservatives who had once supported the Nazis but later disagreed about the path for German capitalism, the working class had resisted Hitler's influence from the start. This is shown in the social composition of the Nazi Party, with Labor's membership nearly half that of the overall population, while the lower middle class was disproportionately represented, and the elite's presence was 4 times greater. Before Hitler rose to power, the Communist Party fought valiantly against the Nazis on the streets. In Prussia alone, during June and July of 1932, 82 people lost their lives in political clashes, mostly Nazis and communists. Tragically, Moscow's assertion that German socialists were social fascists, and worse than Nazis, deepened rifts within the working class. This situation deteriorated further as the SPD mistakenly believed that Hitler would be held back by the Weimar Constitution, thinking their opponents would ultimately fail through legal channels. These errors greatly weakened the left and paved the way for the German elite, led by President Hindenburg, to appoint Hitler as chancellor. Even after he seized power and unleashed brutal repression, the working class continued to fight back. Despite Goebbels' media spreading lies about issues the public wasn't aware of, the Nazis faced challenges in the year 1934. Government-sponsored elections for shop stewards, where the candidates were known to the electorate. Although the one-party state blocked any alternative choices, the votes of no and abstentions accounted for 3/4 of the ballots. Further elections ceased. Workers sought out various tactics to resist the Nazi advance. With no direct access to Hitler's inner circle, efforts from workers couldn't readily include assassination attempts, though a few courageous individuals took that risk. The SPD chose to endure the situation through inaction. On the other hand, the KPD, despite the risks involved, called for an unwavering campaign of mass resistance and struggle. In June 1935, the Berlin KPD alone circulated 62,000 pamphlets, and the SPD's underground newspaper reached a national readership of 250,000. When opportunities arose, workers participated in strikes and sabotaged military production. Even inside concentration camps, the left fought to maintain their physical and moral well-being. At Sachsenhausen camp in Berlin, a group of communists, socialists, and non-party prisoners collaborated to fairly distribute food and clothing, provide political education, uplift spirits through cultural activities, and even organize acts of defiance. However, by the year 1939, widespread popular resistance had been quashed. This didn't mean that the working class accepted Hitler's rule. A report, discreetly sent out by socialists, asserted that 90% of workers were undoubtedly anti-Nazi, yet active resistance against oppressive conditions remained scarce. Small groups like the Red Orchestra, which gathered intelligence for Russia, the White Rose, consisting of students, and the Edelweiss Pirates, a youth group, occasionally surfaced only to be swiftly crushed. The idea of an other war had shrunk to mere skirmishes. Yet, as Pukert highlighted, following the dual trauma of 1933. First, the unresisted defeat, then the terror that split the activists from the passive working class. The amount of political opposition, the commitment and sacrifice of those involved, and their unwavering determination to carry on secret operations in the face of Gestapo setbacks are undeniably notable accomplishments. They mark an important moment in history, regardless of the overall impact of working-class resistance against the Third Reich. When comparing conservative and communist resistance, the differences are illuminating. The conservative side had about 200 activists, yet the repression that followed the July 1944 plot led to around 5,000 opponents being executed. Meanwhile, by the end of the Second World War, the KPD alone saw 300,000 of its members imprisoned and at least 20,000 killed. While it's accurate to say that mass resistance cannot be deemed decisive, it certainly wielded considerable influence. The war that ultimately brought down Nazism stemmed from Germany's efforts to address its social issues through aggressive territorial expansion, pulling itself into conflict with other great powers. Likewise, as Ali pointed out, the Nazis, fearing a repeat of the revolution that ended the First World War, refrained from provoking German workers by not lowering their living standards, which significantly undermined the effectiveness of the Nazi war machine. Churchill and Roosevelt called for sacrifices from their citizens that Hitler hesitated to demand. After the war, Victory in Europe Day was celebrated on May 8, 1945, signifying the decisive blow of Allied imperialism. However, the aim was not to liberate the German people. A representative from the U.S. clarified, "Our goal in occupying Germany is not liberation, but treating it as a defeated enemy state." Russia agreed, forcefully expelling 11 million Germans from Eastern Europe. Stalin found no reason to intervene, brushing aside concerns about soldiers exploiting women after enduring extensive bloodshed. The Red Army had a notorious reputation for mass rape, but it wasn't the only occupying force involved in such actions. The victors were primarily focused on claiming their share of the spoils, rather than the well-being of the German population, who had already endured considerable suffering under Nazism. U.S. Treasury Secretary Morgenthau suggested deindustrializing Germany and breaking it into smaller states, but the State Department disagreed, fearing it would ignite a cycle of revenge and chaos similar to what followed the First World War. Churchill recognized that harsh treatment of Germany could allow the Russians to advance rapidly toward the North Sea and the Atlantic. Consequently, Hitler's chosen successor, Admiral Dönitz, was allowed to maintain control of the government and issue commands. Churchill even retained Luftwaffe planes and around 700,000 soldiers as a precaution against potential Russian advancements. Ultimately, it was an unusual combination of Russian and Daily Mail protests that brought this situation to a halt, resulting in Dönitz's arrest just 2 weeks after Victory in Europe Day. The imperialist agenda also influenced how Hitler's associates were treated. In West Germany, the U.S. aimed to bring Nazis to justice without dismantling the nation's social framework, cautious of letting Russia take advantage of any resulting chaos. This was a complex task, since Nazism was not simply a foreign affliction stemming from a charismatic leader or a wave of collective madness. Although the Nazi Party began as a marginal group, it quickly gained traction with the support of prominent figures like World War I Commander Ludendorff. As traditional middle-class parties were dismantled by hyperinflation in 1923 and the Wall Street crash in 1929, millions turned to the Nazis. As the economy continued to decline, the establishment recognized that, despite the unease surrounding Hitler, the alternative to Nazism could lead to social upheaval and civil disorder. Therefore, they backed his ascent to chancellor in 1933. A year later, Hitler showed his gratitude during the Night of the Long Knives, where he violently purged followers who mistakenly believed Nazism was a break from capitalism. By the time World War II began, key Nazis had established themselves within the social elite. This posed a dilemma for the Western Allies. Removing significant elements of the social hierarchy could unleash radical forces beneath and undermine their power. Unlike the Russians in East Germany, who had clear intentions to eliminate Nazism, solely to tighten Moscow's grip, the Allied military leaders were cautious of the grassroots anti-fascist committees that emerged as the Third Reich fell apart. These committees represented a long-buried resistance to fascism, actively working to counter Hitler's destructive Nero order, which threatened Germany's very infrastructure. In Leipzig, Antifa leaflets encouraged soldiers to abandon their posts, while in Stuttgart, they stood up to pro-war officers. Such daring actions came with great risks. In Dachau, the SS retaliated against the committee's efforts at the town hall, and a similar backlash occurred during their attempt on the police headquarters in Dusseldorf. However, in cities like Mulheim and Solingen, Antifas gained control as Allied troops arrived, allowing them to enter without any resistance. The movement was extensive, with over 120 committees set up nationwide. Leipzig's Antifa alone counted 150,000 members. Many of these organizations worked to bridge deep social divides, bringing together foreign laborers and uniting the working class across various political factions and labor unions. Their initiatives included creating local democratic systems and restoring vital services like food supplies. A report from the United States indicated that the Allies were well aware of the Antifa's aims, opposing the Nazis, preventing an illicit Nazi underground, pushing for denazification in government and industry, and tackling housing and food shortages were all crucial for these newly formed groups. The emergence of numerous committees with aligned names and goals suggests there might have been a centralized leadership behind them. Although communists were integral to nearly every Antifa group, they faced challenges from Moscow. Walter Ulbricht, leader of the KPD, criticized the disorganized setup of KPD offices and committees, but his influence diminished as communication broke down between central leaders and grassroots activists. Once communication improved, he observed that they had dismantled these Antifas and instructed his comrades to align all activities with the state machinery. The Western Allies were equally alarmed by the Antifa's strong pledge to wipe out any remnants of Hitler's party from government and local communities. The authorities in the United States kicked the Leipzig Committee off their premises, ordered the removal of all their flyers and posters, and ultimately banned the organization altogether. Any future attempts to use the name Free Germany National Committee would lead to severe repercussions. The military government stepped in to prevent workplace councils in Solingen from getting rid of Nazi supporters, ultimately disbanding them. In Brunswick, local Nazis apprehended by the Antifa were released by Allied forces. When the Frankfurt Antifa offered shelter to those displaced by bombings in apartments left empty by fleeing Nazis, the authorities evicted those occupants. One GI reflected on the confusion of the situation. It was infuriating to see a town captured, the leaders arrested and replaced by an anti-fascist leader, only to return days later to find the Americans had reinstated the original officials, sidelining the newly appointed leader. This scenario played out repeatedly. It's important to note that the Allied military government's opposition to the Antifas wasn't due to any sympathy for Nazism. There was a more significant concern, as one German industrialist noted, "To be honest, we're anticipating a revolution." So it's no wonder the military government enacted curfews and prohibited gatherings. They were attempting to quell an emerging threat from that direction. Supporters of Hitler faced punishment not for their actions within German society, but as rival imperialists. A people's war against Nazism simply wasn't a viable option in occupied Germany. Therefore, denazification would align with imperialist principles, rather than the will of the people. In East Germany, under Soviet control, 500,000 cases were scrutinized, which accounted for 3% of the population. Moscow aimed to replace the former German regime with their own appointees, leading to a thorough process. Between 1945 and 1965, over 16,000 individuals were put on trial, with almost 13,000 found guilty and 118 sentenced to death. In the Western sector, mass arrests also took place, with 100,000 Nazis detained in the American zone alone. When the Cold War began, Britain, France, and the USA shifted their attention to a new enemy and neglected the old one. As a result, denazification efforts came to a standstill. This change meant that even the worst offenders were often regarded as mere followers, making them eligible for amnesty. Consequently, many individuals affiliated with groups branded as criminal by the Nuremberg Tribunal were exonerated. The local impact was clear when Sinti witnesses, also known as gypsies, testified about the horrors inflicted by a cruel Nazi guard named Himmelheber in a German court. Despite the immense suffering endured by Sinti and Roma during the Holocaust, Himmelheber was acquitted on appeal, as it was claimed that the accounts of Zigeuner were unreliable. Racist attitudes persisted. For instance, in 1951, a senior police official still called Sinti and Roma genetically criminals and antisocial persons. In the British zone, 90% of Nazi detainees were released. In West Germany, which had a population 3 times larger than the East, only 12,500 were tried, with 5,000 convicted and 9 sentenced to execution. This leniency starkly contrasted with the Nazi military courts, which executed 26,000, yet not a single judge or prosecutor from that time was held accountable. As one historian pointed out, the tribunals were compared to laundries. People entered wearing a brown shirt and left in a fresh, starched white one. Denazification shifted from an initiative aimed at purging Germany's economy, administration, and society of Nazis to a process centered on rehabilitating individuals. The small fry were punished to serve the political motives of the imperialist powers, while the primary offenders from the capitalist elite escaped repercussions. In West Germany, major companies like IG Farben, the producers of the gas used at Auschwitz, and the large banks came through nearly untouched by the decartelization efforts, which were weakened in 1947. Throughout the war, ordinary Germans faced the harsh repression of Nazism. The Allies, in contrast, enforced collective punishment through area bombings and ignored mass rape. When it came time to distinguish between those connected to the Third Reich and the victims, the Allies showed little willingness to engage. The brutal measures of the Gestapo had crushed any hope for a popular uprising. As a result, by the time Nazism faced its inevitable downfall in 1945, the growing resistance, symbolized by an Antifa movement in both parts of Germany, was no match for the powerful Allied forces.